Hi, I'm Krista Arthur, Security Consultant for Vox Network Solutions. Today I'm interviewing Virtual Chief Information Security Officer James Rothman. And James is going to be talking about the intersection between CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and New York Shield, these new privacy regulations, and how they interact and overlap with PCI, DSS, and HIPAA. And stay tuned. If you have to be HIPAA compliant and you think that you're covered under the CCPA exemption, you may be very surprised. So stay tuned. Hi, James.
Hello, Krista. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you.
I'm really excited today to talk about CCPA, which we'll define what that is in a little while, CCPA, New York Shield, and how that relates to the contact centers who have to be either PCI compliant and or HIPAA compliant, because I think there's a lot of myths around, do I need to be, I don't need to be, and so we're going to talk about that today. So thank you for being here.
Great. My pleasure.
So can you define CCPA and New York Shield, just in case people aren't that familiar with it?
Absolutely. CCPA is a California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA for short. Basically, it's a statewide data privacy law. It regulates how businesses all over the world are allowed to handle personal information of California residents. CCPA became effective earlier this year, January 1st, actually, of this year, and it's the first law of its kind in the United States. It follows the lead of the General Data Protection, or GDPR, rule in Europe, which got so much press approximately 2 years ago. So the intentions of the act are to provide California residents with the right to know what data is being collected about them, to know whether their data is being sold, to say no to the sale of their data, and to access their personal data. I mean, that's sort of the crux of what CCPA is and the reason for it. The new law, the New York Shield Act, basically is a new law. And interestingly enough, it's an acronym, actually. Most people don't realize that. It means Stop Hacks and Improve Electronic Data Security Act. Again, much easier to just say Shield Act or the New York Shield Act. So the New York Shield Act is pretty much, it's New York's version of CCPA. It basically broadens the state's data breach notification requirements, and it requires businesses to have reasonable data security safeguards. Of course, they don't necessarily outline exactly what those reasonable data security safeguards are. It's up to the companies themselves to determine that and for legal to determine that. But the act became effective in October of 2019, basically for changes in data breach notification, and in March of 2020, this year, for new data security requirements. So basically, it applies to any person or businesses, even those outside of the state, owning or licensing data collection of private information of the New York resident. Like I said, exactly like CCPA, but it's pretty much in New York. Eventually, the thought process is that there's going to be a federal law, but again, we're not there at this time. Right now, only 2 states have this particular law.
I'm sure it's coming up because there was a recent study that said by 2023, I think it was a Gardner study, 65% of the world's population will be under some form of privacy law or regulation. So we know that this is really important for organizations to wrap their minds around.
Absolutely. And the reality is, in the end, if every single state has a different law, it's going to be untenable. It's going to be absolutely impossible to follow. If you have, if you're a company and you have data across the board, multiple states, it's going to be impossible to actually follow each of the laws. So I'm guessing, again, right now there are 2 of them. I'm guessing once we hit 3, 4, 5, someone's going to jump in, or the federal government will probably jump in and say, okay, we need to have a federal type system. Or maybe they'll match GDPR, which is basically across Europe in most of the countries in the European Union.
What are the fines similar with New York Shield as they are with the California Consumer Privacy Act?
It's indeterminate right now. I mean, they say that there are fines and there are penalties, but right now it's not yet really as clear as CCPA, which outlines exactly what those fines are. So the answer is yes, there are fines, but again, still being tweaked and worked on as far as exactly how they're going to fine you for non-compliance.
I know that there is a measure on the ballot in California about creating a enforcement agency around CCPA. So if that passes this year, there's going to be even more onus on any organization that's doing business here in California and collecting consumer California.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about CCPA, most companies first of all, don't know what it is,
right.
Don't realize that they need to abide by it. And the reality is many companies have to abide by it. So it's an issue. It's an issue right now. So I think, the word needs to be spread basically to say, hey, there's this law, you've got to follow it, and the consequences can be major. I mean, basically enough to shut your business down.
Yeah, the fines with CCPA are huge.
They're
so
huge. Yeah.
What about PCI? If an organization is PCI compliant, do they need to worry about CCPA or New York Shield? Is there any overlap or?
Absolutely. Yeah. There is some overlap. So the reality is this: if an organization is PCI or what's called PCI-DSS compliant, they may have already implemented data privacy and protection regulations and practices to satisfy certain CCPA or New York Shield Act requirements. However, CCPA describes personal information as any data that directly or indirectly identifies a particular person or household, while PCI focuses primarily on payment card data. So there's a different priority for different forms of information. And, CCPA compels organizations to implement and maintain, as I mentioned earlier on, reasonable security controls and practices. PCI-DSS provides more in-depth security controls, both of which are considered reasonable best practices. So if you follow PCI-DSS security practices, you will be in compliance for CCPA. However, CCPA has many additional privacy components that are not included with PCI. So, for example, privacy disclosures, handling of consumer requests, data inventories, data flows, consumer rights processing capabilities, cookie consent, and so on and so forth. So, again, it's really a subset of just the security portion, and even there, not entirely, because PCI very often just focuses on one segment of your business, the segment of your business that collects or processes credit card information, that sort of thing. Think of CCPA as having data privacy like GDPR and data security like PCI-DSS. That's probably the best way to look at it.
That is a really good way of looking at it, because I think for a lot of organizations, there's some confusion about how security marries with privacy, and you need them both. So that's really interesting. What about HIPAA? Now, I know that we've had some organizations push back and say, well, we're HIPAA compliant, so we don't need to worry about CCPA because they're already kind of taking care of the PII and the PHI.
So it's interesting because, I've heard this often. The health sector doesn't completely avoid CCPA or New York Shield Act. There is a HIPAA exemption. However, it doesn't completely cover it. So the question of the HIPAA exclusion to CCPA comes up really often. Namely, CCPA exempts all protected health information collected by organizations subject to HIPAA. It also exempts patient information maintained by other what's called covered entities. It goes on and on. However, here's the crux of it. Healthcare entities and businesses in the health sector have to exercise caution not to rely too heavily on the law's HIPAA-related exemptions as a complete pass to avoid complying with CCPA. Companies that are subject to HIPAA have to analyze what patient information they maintain for what's called PHI, for personal health information, and what patient information they maintain outside of HIPAA. So companies likely create or maintain or otherwise process personal information that falls outside these exemptions, so they have to evaluate data processing activities to identify these outliers. As an example, just to clarify, the following types of data could be subject to CCPA. For example, if there's personal information collected through websites, health apps, health portals, or other digital technology that's not regulated by HIPAA, or personal information that's collected through in-person conferences, fundraisers, marketing events, or similar activities. And the list goes on and on. So the most prudent course would be to assume that the HIPAA exemption covers only the PHI, the patient information of the HIPAA-related organizations. And you have to design privacy policies and practices accordingly based on that. So organizations in the healthcare sector should renew their data inventories carefully, reassess their privacy practices to account for this interaction between HIPAA and CCPA.
That's really good to know, and I bet you there's a lot of organizations right now that are HIPAA compliant thinking we need to go talk to our CISO, our compliance officer. We need to really look at this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, common misconception, because there is something that basically states there is the CCPA exemption. Mm-hmm. But again, you have to take that with a grain of salt and really drill down to what exactly it means. It's only for a particular type of information that you're collecting.
Well, this has been really great information, I think, for organizations that are trying to weed through the privacy and the security and the regulations and everything else that they have to do. So thank you so much for clearing that up, or at least shining a little bit of light on.
My
on
pleasure.
Subject.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Hi, I hope you enjoyed today's interview with James. The intersection between security, privacy, and compliance can be very complex, so we always recommend that you speak to legal counsel regarding these matters. Just for your peace of mind, we do have a CCPA and New York Shield assessment that can help to shed some light on where you are in relation to these laws, even if you are PCI compliant and even if you are complying with HIPAA. We also have other security assessments that we'd be glad to speak to you about. So if you have any questions about security, privacy, or compliance, please give us a call. We're looking forward to working with you.